A mafia boss visited his wife's grave and found two little twin girls already there, praying for her. He had never seen them before. His wife had never once mentioned their names. What he didn't know, those twin girls carried a secret his wife had taken to her grave. And when he finally discovered the truth, it didn't just break him. It changed him forever. Victor Kane had not cried in 11 years, not when he'd ordered his first kill at 26, not when 3 of his men were buried in a single week after a turf war, not even on the night the doctors walked out of that hospital room with their eyes low and their words soft and useless. But every year, on the morning of February 14th, he came here, alone. No guards, no convoy, no Marcus trailing 2 steps behind like a well-dressed shadow. Just Victor, a black coat, and a bouquet of white lilies that cost more than most people's rent, because Emily had always said red roses were what men gave women when they had no imagination. He smiled at that, the way you smile at something that still hurts. The cemetery was almost empty at this hour, a groundskeeper far in the distance, a crow sitting still on a stone angel like it owned the place, frost on the grass that crunched quietly under Victor's shoes as he walked the familiar path he could have walked blind. He didn't need to read the names on the stones anymore. He knew exactly where she was. Emily Kane, beloved, 1981 to 2021. 3 years. And the grave still looked like someone tended it regularly. Fresh flowers in the iron holder, the stone wiped clean. Victor had a service for that. He paid them well to make sure she was never neglected, the way he had neglected her when she was alive. He crouched down and placed the lilies carefully. "Happy Valentine's Day," he said quietly. "I know, stupid holiday. You always said that too." He stayed there a moment, one hand resting on the cold stone, not praying. Victor Kane didn't pray, just existing in the only place in the city where he allowed himself to be small. That's when he heard them. Soft voices, low and steady, like a murmur. At first he thought it was the wind threading through the bare trees, but wind didn't have rhythm. Wind didn't have words. He turned. 2 girls, side by side, kneeling on the frost-stiff grass 2 rows behind him. Young, maybe 9 or 10, identical in the way that made you look twice just to confirm you weren't imagining it. Same dark braids, same second-hand winter coats, one navy, one forest green. Same posture, heads bowed, hands folded, lips moving in quiet prayer. They were praying at Emily's grave. Victor stood slowly. His first instinct, always his first instinct, was suspicion. Who sent them? Who would use children? Which one of his enemies had decided this was a move worth making? But then he watched them longer. They weren't performing. Nobody performs like that with no audience. The girl in the navy coat was crying, not dramatically, just a steady, quiet leak from the corner of her eye that she wiped with her sleeve without pausing the prayer. The other one had a small paper bag on the grass beside her, and as Victor watched, she reached in and carefully removed 2 envelopes, handwritten, sealed with stickers, little gold stars, the kind you get from a school supply store. She placed them gently against the base of the headstone like she was leaving something precious. Victor didn't move. He barely breathed. When they finally rose, the girls noticed him standing there and startled, the way children startle around strangers, a quick, full-body flinch. They looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes. He must have looked enormous to them, 6'2", jaw like granite, a scar along his left brow that he'd stopped explaining years ago. "Sorry," the one in the green coat said quickly, grabbing her sister's hand. "We didn't know anyone else would be here." "It's fine," Victor said. The word came out rougher than he intended. They moved past him fast, heads down, the way people moved past Victor Kane when they knew better. He watched them go, their small footsteps crunching across the frost toward the iron gate. He turned back to the grave, 2 gold-starred envelopes leaning against Emily's headstone. His wife's headstone. He should have left them. They weren't his. They were clearly private. The handwriting on the front was loopy and uneven, the way children write when they're still figuring out how to make their letters behave. He should have left them. His hand reached out anyway. One of the envelopes had not been fully tucked in. The flap was loose, and as Victor picked it up to set it more securely against the stone, a single folded page slipped free and fell open against his knee. He read it without meaning to. 3 sentences in, he couldn't stop. Thank you for keeping your promise to protect us after Daddy died. Emily said you would always make sure we were okay. We don't have much, but we came to say thank you anyway, because Emily said that's what good people do. Victor read it twice, then a third time. His wife's name, written by a child he had never seen before in his life. A promise Emily had made to 2 little girls that she had never once mentioned to him. The cemetery was silent except for the crow, still watching from its stone angel. Victor Kane had not cried in 11 years, but his hands, for the first time in a very long time, were not steady. The penthouse smelled like leather and expensive silence. 42 floors above the city, the noise of Chicago became something abstract, just light and movement seen through floor-to-ceiling glass, distant and harmless, like watching the world through a sealed window of a plane. Victor had chosen this apartment for exactly that reason. Up here, nothing felt urgent. Up here, he could think. Tonight, he couldn't think at all. He stood at the window with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, the city glittering below him like something that owed him a debt, and the letter on the kitchen counter behind him like it was alive. He'd carried it home in his coat pocket. He hadn't planned to, but when he'd stood up from Emily's grave and looked toward the gate, the girls were already gone, 2 small shapes dissolving into the gray Chicago morning, and the letter was still in his hand. He told himself he'd read it fully and then bring it back. Leave it at the grave where it belonged. That was 6 hours ago. He turned from the window, set the whiskey down, untouched, and picked up the letter again. It was written on lined notebook paper, the kind torn from a school binder. 2 pages, front and back. 2 different handwriting styles, which told him both girls had written it together, trading the pen back and forth. One script was rounder, more careful. The other leaned forward like it was in a hurry. He read it slowly this time. No rushing. Every word. Dear Emily, we came again like we promised. Lily wanted to bring sunflowers because you said once they were your favorite, but the shop near the bus stop only had yellow carnations, so we got those instead. We hope that's okay. We've been thinking about you a lot. Nora got a 91 on her maths test, and the first thing she said was, I wish Emily could see this. Mrs. Hargrove at the home is nicer now, since the new funding came in for the heating. We don't know where that came from, but it's much warmer at night. We still have the letters you left us. We keep them under the loose floorboard like you told us. We read them when things get hard. We also want to say thank you again for keeping your promise to protect us after Daddy died. Emily said you would always make sure we were okay. We don't have much, but we came to say thank you anyway, because Emily said that's what good people do. We miss you every day, but we're not scared anymore. You made us not scared. Love, Lily and Nora Brooks. P.S. Nora says to tell you she's still mad at you for leaving, but she doesn't mean it the bad way. Victor set the letter down. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and stood very still for a long moment. The new funding came in for the heating. He pulled out his phone and opened his banking app, navigated to Emily's personal account, the one he'd frozen after her death but never closed, kept as some sentimental reflex he'd never examined too carefully. He scrolled back through the transaction history. He glanced at it once after she died, seen nothing unusual, and moved on. He hadn't looked carefully enough. There, spread over 4 years, buried between grocery purchases and pharmacy charges and coffee shops, were withdrawals. Never large enough to question. 200 here, 300 there, once 600. Always cash, always consistent, almost rhythmic, like a subscription to something private. His jaw tightened. He cross-referenced the dates. The withdrawals lined up. School term starts. Winter months. He saw one in December 2 years before she died, right before Christmas. Emily had been funding these girls for years, quietly, methodically, the way she did everything she didn't want him to notice, folded into ordinary life, invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. She'd never said a word. He called Marcus at 11:14 p.m. Marcus Reed answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake. Marcus was always awake when Victor called late. It was one of the things Victor had relied on for 15 years. The man had the instincts of someone who understood that in their world, a late-night call either meant opportunity or disaster, and you answered either way. "Boss?" His voice was steady, calm. Marcus Reed had a voice built for calm. "I need you to find 2 girls," Victor said. "Twins, around 10 years old, last name Brooks. They were at Elmwood Cemetery this morning." A pause, short, maybe 2 seconds. Most people wouldn't have caught it. Victor caught it. "Brooks," Marcus repeated. "You sure about the name?" "I don't repeat myself, Marcus." "Right, of course." Another half-beat of something. Not hesitation exactly, more like a man quietly rearranging his expression over the phone. "I'll have something for you by morning. Foster system? Start there. Any particular reason we're looking into children?" Victor looked at the letter on the counter, at the gold star sticker still clinging to the envelope flap, at his wife's name written in a 10-year-old's loopy, careful handwriting. "They knew Emily," he said. "She made them a promise without telling me. I want to know why." Silence. This one longer. 3 seconds. 4. "I'll look into it," Marcus said finally. His voice hadn't changed in pitch or tone, but something in it had shifted in a way Victor couldn't fully name. It was like watching still water and sensing current underneath. "Get some rest, Victor." Victor hung up without responding. He stood in his kitchen for a long time after that. The city hummed below him, indifferent. He picked up his whiskey, finally drank it, and poured another. Marcus had called him Victor. In 15 years, Marcus Reed had called him boss every single time. On calls, in rooms, in front of others, in private. It was muscle memory for the man, a habit so deep it had become identity. Tonight, just now, unprompted, Victor. It was a small thing, the kind of thing you could explain away easily. A slip, fatigue, informality born from a late hour. Victor himself might have let it pass on any other night, but tonight his hands had already been unsteady once, and the name Brooks had done something to Marcus Reed's voice, just for a moment, just for a breath, that a stranger's name had no business doing. Victor walked back to the window. 42 floors up, the city looked orderly from here. Neat grids of light, everything in its place. He had built his power on that illusion, the idea that he could see everything from high enough up, that distance gave you clarity. But Emily had lived right beside him, slept in the same bed, eaten at the same table, and she had kept an entire hidden world. Children, promises, secret kindnesses, years of quiet repair, tucked beneath the surface of their life together. He hadn't seen any of it, which meant either he wasn't as observant as he believed, or someone had helped her hide it. He thought about Marcus's pause, that small, damning hesitation when he heard the name Brooks. He thought about the letter, after Daddy died. He thought about how, in his world, fathers didn't simply die. They were removed, deliberately, with his permission. He poured a third whiskey and didn't drink it. Tomorrow, he decided, he wouldn't wait for Marcus's report. He would find the girls himself. Victor drove himself. That alone said something. Victor Kane did not drive himself anywhere. He had people for that, a driver, a security rotation, a whole choreography of protection built around the understanding that a man in his position was always a target. Getting into a car alone and heading toward the suburbs without telling anyone was the kind of decision that would have made Marcus nervous. which was precisely why he hadn't told Marcus. He'd pulled the address himself, the old-fashioned way, a contact inside the city's foster care administration who owed him a favor, a quick exchange, a name and a street confirmed before 7 in the morning. The contact had asked no questions. People who owed Victor Kane favors never did. He parked half a block down from the house on Elmfield Drive and turned the engine off. It was a narrow 2-story in a row of similar houses, practical, slightly tired, the kind of house that had been repainted just often enough to avoid looking neglected, but not often enough to look loved. A chain-link fence bordered a small yard where a rusted swing set stood at a tilt. 3 bicycles leaned against the porch railing in various states of repair. A welcome mat at the front door that said "Home" in faded letters, as if trying to convince someone. Victor sat in the car and watched. He was good at watching. It was one of his oldest skills, the ability to go completely still and let information come to him rather than chasing it. Most men in power got impatient. They pushed, demanded, accelerated. Victor had learned early that the most valuable thing you could do in an unfamiliar situation was nothing, for as long as you could stand it. At 8:45, the front door opened. 2 girls stepped out onto the porch. Even from half a block away, he recognized them immediately. Same dark braids, same cautious way of moving that he'd noticed at the cemetery, like they were always quietly calculating the space around them. The one in the navy coat. Nora, he guessed, from the letter's description of the girl who was still mad but didn't mean it the bad way, came out first, backpack already on, expression set like she had somewhere important to be. The other one, Lily, followed behind, adjusting her scarf, saying something that made Nora pause on the porch steps and almost smile. Almost. They walked to the corner, where a yellow school bus appeared exactly on schedule, climbed aboard, and were gone. Victor waited another 10 minutes. Then he got out of the car, crossed the street, and knocked on the door. The woman who answered was somewhere in her mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had probably been warm once and had since been worn into something more practical by years of exhausting work. She was still in her housecoat, coffee mug in hand, and she looked at Victor the way people looked at things that didn't fit. A long, assessing pause. "Can I help you?" she said. Not unfriendly, not welcoming. Victor had prepared for this. He was wearing a plain gray jacket instead of his usual tailored coat, no visible jewelry, nothing that announced what he was. He'd looked at himself in the car mirror before getting out and thought he still looked like trouble, but perhaps the quieter variety. "My name is Victor. I was a friend of Emily Kane," he said. "I think she used to visit 2 girls here, twins. I was hoping I could ask a few questions. I'm not from any agency." The woman studied him for another long moment. He met her eyes steadily and let her look. "Margaret Doyle," she said finally. "I've been running this house for 14 years. She didn't step aside to let him in, but she didn't close the door either. "Emily visited here, yes. Lovely woman. We were sad to hear she passed." "You knew her well?" "Well enough. She came every few weeks for a while, brought groceries sometimes, school things, never made a fuss about it." Margaret Doyle tilted her head slightly. "She never mentioned a Victor." "No," he said. "She wouldn't have." Something in his honesty must have registered because the woman's posture shifted, just slightly, just enough. She pushed the door a little wider and leaned against the frame. "The girls are at school," she said. "I know. I'm not here to see them. Not yet." He paused. "Their last name is Brooks. Can you tell me anything about their family? Their father?" Margaret Doyle's expression changed. A cloud moved through it. Not suspicion this time, but something heavier. Grief, maybe. Or the particular exhaustion that came from knowing a sad story you'd had to explain too many times. "Daniel Brooks," she said quietly. "He died about 5 years ago. The girls were 5, maybe 6. No mother in the picture. She'd left when they were babies. Daniel was raising them alone." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug like she needed the warmth. "Good man, from what I was told. The girls don't talk about him much, but when they do..." She shook her head. You can tell. He was a good father. Victor kept his face entirely still. He was very good at that. How did he die? He asked. The question came out evenly, professionally, the way he asked 100 questions that carried weight he never showed. Nobody told the girls much, Margaret said. Official story was an accident, warehouse district, wrong place, wrong time. She looked at Victor carefully. The kind of thing that happens in certain parts of this city when a man gets involved with the wrong people, or when the wrong people decide he's a problem. The wrong people. Victor heard the phrase land in his chest like something with mass. He knew the warehouse district. He knew it the way a surgeon knows the inside of a body. Every corridor, every arrangement, every deal that had ever been finalized there. He had approved operations in that district 100 times without losing a single night's sleep. Daniel Brooks. The name had pricked at him since he'd read it in the letter. A distant familiarity, the kind that lived not in your memory but in your gut. And standing here now, on this porch, hearing the words warehouse district and wrong place, wrong time, it clicked. Not slowly, not with effort. It cracked open all at once, like ice giving way underfoot. He remembered the name. He remembered the file. A courier, mid-level, reliable, until suddenly he wasn't. A report had come to Victor's desk 5 years ago. Daniel Brooks, suspected of feeding information to a rival operation, leaking shipment routes, compromising the network. The evidence had been clean, documented. Marcus had presented it himself, neat and certain, the way Marcus always was. Victor had signed off in under a minute. He remembered because there had been nothing remarkable about it. It had been routine. One name among many, in a year full of hard decisions. He had not asked for more evidence. He had not questioned the file. He had trusted Marcus, as he always trusted Marcus, and he had moved on to the next item on the agenda. Daniel Brooks had been removed. His daughters, apparently, had been left to a foster home in the suburbs. And Emily, somehow, impossibly, had found out. Sir? Victor realized Margaret Doyle was looking at him with a new expression now, less guarded than before, almost concerned, the way people looked when someone went quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. Thank you, he said. His voice came out steady. Years of practice. You've been very helpful. He turned and walked back down the porch steps before she could ask anything else. He crossed the street to his car, sat down, put both hands on the steering wheel and looked straight through the windshield, at nothing. The rusted swing set in the yard was moving slightly in the wind, empty and tilting, creaking a sound too quiet to hear from inside the car. He sat there for a long time. Daniel Brooks had been innocent. Victor didn't know it yet as absolute fact, but he knew, the way you know things you'd rather not, that he was going to find out it was true. He could feel it already, settling into the structure of everything, rearranging what he thought he had built and what it had actually cost. He started the engine. He needed to find Emily's storage unit. He almost missed it entirely. It was a single key, small, brass, unremarkable, tucked inside the lining of Emily's winter coat, the one he had boxed up after her funeral and shoved to the back of his wardrobe because he couldn't look at it and couldn't throw it away. He'd been living in that in-between for 3 years. Most grief, he was learning, lived there. He'd gone through her things last night, methodically, room by room, with the focused detachment he used when searching for information he needed but didn't want. He'd found nothing unusual in her desk, her wardrobe, her bedside drawer. But the coat? He'd pressed his hands along its lining out of habit, the same way his men swept rooms for hidden things, and his fingers had found the small, hard shape of the key stitched carefully into the interior hem. Not accidentally stored, deliberately hidden. The key had a tag, written in Emily's handwriting, Unit 114, Secure Store, East Garfield. He hadn't slept. The storage facility was the kind of place designed to be forgotten, a long, low building on a street that didn't invite attention, sandwiched between an auto repair shop and a tire wholesaler. No frills. Monthly rent paid in cash, the manager confirmed, going back 6 years. The account name was E. Harlow, Emily's maiden name, which she hadn't used since the day they married. She had rented this unit 2 years before she was diagnosed, which meant she hadn't opened it in a panic or in desperation. She had planned it quietly, deliberately, in the middle of an ordinary life, and she had maintained it without him ever knowing. Unit 114 was at the far end of the corridor. Victor unlocked it alone. The shutter rolled up with a sound like held breath releasing. It was not a large space, maybe 8 feet deep, 6 wide, but it was organized. Emily had always been organized. Plastic storage boxes stacked neatly along one wall, each one labeled in her clean handwriting. A folding table against the back with a small lamp, extension cord looped around its base. A chair, as if she had sat here, in this borrowed, secret room, and worked. He started with the boxes. The first one contained folders, financial records, each one dated and tabbed. He flipped through them and found what he was already beginning to expect: years of careful, structured giving. Tuition payments routed through a small charitable trust he'd never heard of. The Harlow Fund, of course, to an elementary school in the western suburbs. Medical bills for 2 children, paid in full. Winter clothing purchases, school supplies. Christmas every year without exception. The amounts were never extravagant. They were precise and practical. The giving of someone who understood what a child actually needed versus what looked generous from a distance. She had been doing this since the girls were barely 6 years old, since 6 months after Daniel Brooks died. The second box hit him differently. Photographs. Hundreds of them, printed and sorted into envelopes by year, each envelope labeled with a date range in the same clean handwriting. He opened the earliest one, dated 5.5 years ago, and found Emily. He hadn't expected the force of it, seeing her face suddenly in the middle of this room he hadn't known existed. She looked younger in these photos, still healthy, still herself, before the illness had started quietly dismantling her from the inside. She was sitting at a picnic table in what looked like a public park, and across from her were 2 small girls, barely more than toddlers, dark-haired, wide-eyed, and Emily was laughing at something one of them had said, her whole face open and unguarded in a way he recognized from their early years together, before his world had built walls around everything, including her. He turned through photograph after photograph, Emily pushing the girls on swings, Emily helping one of them, Lily, he thought, the rounder handwriting, the careful one, with what looked like a school project, both of them bent over a poster board with colored markers. Emily at a birthday party in what was clearly the foster home's backyard, holding a small cake with candles while the twins leaned in to blow them out. Emily asleep in the chair beside 2 small figures curled on a couch. A children's film still running on the television in the background, her hand resting gently on one girl's shoulder, even in sleep. She had loved them. Not as a charity case, not as a project or an obligation or a way to ease guilt. She had genuinely, quietly, completely loved these 2 girls. Victor set the photographs down on the folding table and pressed his hands flat against the surface. He breathed. The third box contained letters, 2 sets of them, bound separately with rubber bands. The first set was from Emily to the girls, never sent, written over years in her handwriting. He read only the first one before he had to stop. My darlings, I know you don't fully understand yet why I come to see you, or why I make sure you have what you need. Someday I'll explain it properly. For now, just know that what happened to your father was not your fault, and it was not his fault either. There are men in this world who make decisions that cost good people everything. I married one of them. I can't undo what was done, but I can make sure that the 2 of you grow up knowing someone saw you, someone chose you, someone will always make sure you're okay. He stopped reading. He set the letter down carefully, the way you set down something fragile. The second bundle was from the girls, letters they had written to Emily over the years, brought during visits and left with her, or posted to a P.O. box he found referenced in one of the financial folders. He didn't read these. He couldn't. He gathered them gently and set them aside like they belonged to someone else. Because they did. He sat in the folding chair for a long time. The storage unit smelled faintly of paper and the particular dryness of sealed rooms, and the single lamp cast a warm yellow circle that made everything outside it feel very far away. Victor sat inside that circle and allowed himself to understand, fully and without defense, what he was looking at. Emily had known. She had found out, somehow, at some point, that Daniel Brooks had died because of Victor. That the file Marcus presented had been enough to get a man killed without question, without trial, without a second opinion from anyone. That 2 little girls had been left without a father because of a decision made in under a minute by her husband. And she had not confronted him. She had not screamed, had not left, had not reported him. She would have known exactly how that ended. Instead, she had opened a storage unit on a forgettable street under her maiden name, set up a quiet trust fund, and for 5 years she had shown up, faithfully, consistently. She had fed and clothed and tutored and celebrated and comforted 2 girls who had no one, not because it absolved anyone, but because they deserved someone. She had known exactly who Victor was, and she had loved him anyway, while simultaneously, quietly, making sure the cost of his choices wasn't entirely borne by children. That was the part that undid him, not the secret, not the hidden life, the separate key, the months of careful concealment. It was the love, that she had held both truths at once, who he was and who she believed he could become. And she had never forced him to choose. She had simply gone ahead and done the work herself. He looked at the last photograph in the earliest envelope. Emily, standing in autumn sunlight outside the cemetery's iron gate, alone, face turned slightly away from the camera like she'd asked someone to take it for her. She was looking at something out of frame, smiling, not the big open smile from the picnic photos, but something smaller, private. On the back, in her handwriting, "For the girls, when they're older, so they know someone always came back." Victor closed the box. He turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a moment before standing, the way you sit in a church after everyone else has left, not praying, just letting the weight of the space do what it needed to do. Then he locked the unit, pocketed the key, and walked back out into daylight. He needed to talk to Marcus. Victor chose the location deliberately. Not his penthouse, where Marcus would feel the cushion of familiarity. Not the restaurant on Michigan Avenue where they held their regular Wednesday meetings, surrounded by men and noise and the comfortable ritual of business as usual. He chose the warehouse on Delancey Street, the same building where, 5 years ago, a man named Daniel Brooks had been brought in, questioned, and never walked out of. He wanted Marcus to feel the geography of it. He arrived 30 minutes early and stood in the center of the empty floor, hands in his pockets, listening to the building settle around him. It was a vast, hollow space. Concrete floors stained with old oil, high industrial windows letting in the last gray light of the afternoon, steel beams running overhead like the ribcage of something enormous. It smelled of rust and cold air and the particular staleness of a place that had been used for things that didn't bear remembering. Victor remembered them anyway. He heard Marcus's car pull up outside at 6 on the dot. Marcus Reed was always exactly on time. Another one of his qualities Victor had always valued, the same way you valued a well-calibrated instrument. Reliable, precise, useful. He was reconsidering what useful had cost him. Marcus came through the side door, paused for just a fraction of a second when he registered the building, then crossed the floor toward Victor with his usual measured pace. He was dressed sharply, even for a warehouse meeting. Charcoal suit, collar open, the kind of composed presentation that didn't slip regardless of the setting. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Victor with steady, watchful eyes. "You picked quite the venue," Marcus said. "I know you remember it," Victor said. Marcus said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Victor studied him for a long moment. 15 years. He had known this man for 15 years, trusted him with operations, with money, with information that could have destroyed everything if it had reached the wrong hands. He had stood beside him at Emily's funeral. He had relied on him so completely that the reliance had become invisible, like load-bearing walls you stop noticing until one of them cracks. "Daniel Brooks," Victor said. The name landed in the space between them and stayed there. Marcus's expression didn't collapse. It was never going to collapse. He wasn't built that way. But something behind his eyes recalibrated. A subtle shift, like a man adjusting his footing on uneven ground. "What about him?" Marcus said. "Tell me about the file." "Victor, the file, Marcus." Victor's voice was quiet. The quieter he got, the more dangerous he became, and Marcus knew it. "The one you brought me 5 years ago. Daniel Brooks, suspected informant, leaking shipment routes to the Delgado operation. You presented it. I signed off. Walk me through it." Marcus was silent for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled release, the kind that preceded a decision, and straightened slightly. "He was a liability," Marcus said. "The routes that were being leaked were coming from his section of the network. The pattern pointed to him." "The pattern pointed to him," Victor repeated. "Was he guilty?" Another pause, longer this time. "We believed he was." "That's not what I asked." Victor took one step forward, just one. "Was Daniel Brooks guilty of leaking those routes or not?" Marcus looked at him directly, not with guilt, something more complicated than guilt. The expression of a man who had made a calculation he still believed was correct, and was now being asked to defend the mathematics to someone who had changed the value of the variables. "No," Marcus said quietly. "He wasn't." The word dropped into the warehouse like something thrown from a great height. Victor had known it was coming. He had felt it building since the cemetery, since the letter, since the photograph of Emily asleep on a couch with 2 little girls. But hearing it stated plainly, in Marcus's flat, certain voice, was different from knowing it was true. It made it real in a way that knowledge alone couldn't. "Then who was?" Victor said. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Reyes, one of our freight coordinators on the north side. He was running a side arrangement with Delgado, selling route information, pocketing the difference. When we started closing in, he redirected suspicion, pointed the evidence toward Brooks." He paused. "Deliberately." "And you knew this," Victor said. "When did you know?" The silence that followed was the longest one yet. 6 seconds. 7. "I confirmed it about 2 months after Brooks was removed," Marcus said. "Reyes made a mistake, got overconfident, left a paper trail. When I found it, I'd already handled Reyes separately." "Separately," Victor repeated. "Meaning you eliminated him quietly, without telling me, because telling me would have meant explaining that we'd killed an innocent man based on a file you presented without verifying it fully." Marcus didn't deny it. He met Victor's eyes with the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this moment in some corner of his mind and had arrived at a kind of armored acceptance. "It was already done," Marcus said. "Telling you would have served no purpose, except to destabilize things at a time when we couldn't afford instability. Brooks was gone, Reyes was handled, the operation was intact. That was the priority." "That was the priority," Victor said softly. He turned away and walked a few steps toward the far wall, looking up at the high windows where the last of the daylight was turning the color of old copper. He stood there for a moment with his back to Marcus, which was either a demonstration of trust or a demonstration of contempt, and he wasn't entirely sure which one he meant. Daniel Brooks had been brought into this building a father. He had left it something else entirely. And his daughters had grown up in a foster home, while Victor Kane had returned to his penthouse, 42 floors above the city, and continued signing papers and giving orders, and never once questioning the cost. And Marcus had known. For 5 years, Marcus had known, and had said nothing, and had continued standing 2 steps behind Victor like a well-dressed shadow. "You've been looking into the girls," Marcus said from behind him. His voice had shifted, still controlled, but there was an edge in it now. Careful. Probing. "Lily and Nora Brooks. You went to the foster home yourself. You've been to Emily's storage unit." Victor turned. "You've been having me followed." "I've been keeping an eye on things," Marcus said. "The way I always have. The way you've always relied on me to." He held Victor's gaze. "Victor, whatever Emily was doing, whatever she told herself she was fixing, it's done. She's gone. The girls are alive. They're housed. They're in school. The debt, if there is one, has been managed." "Managed," Victor said. "Walking back into their lives doesn't fix what happened. It creates exposure. For you, for them, for everything we've built." Marcus paused, and his voice dropped to something that was almost gentle. "Let it go. That's my counsel. As someone who has kept this operation standing for 15 years beside you, let it go." Victor looked at him for a long time. The man standing in front of him was not a monster. That was the complicated part, the part that Emily would have understood better than anyone. Marcus Reed was a practical man who had made a practical decision in service of a practical empire, and he had spent 15 years being exactly right, exactly useful, exactly what Victor needed. And an innocent man had died because of it, and 2 little girls had grown up knowing their father was never coming home. And Emily, who had seen all of it, who had known exactly what kind of world she was living inside, had said nothing to Victor because she loved him, and had spent 5 years quietly trying to repair what she couldn't confront directly. "I heard you," Victor said finally. He walked toward the door without another word. Marcus stayed where he was, watching him go, and Victor could feel it, the precise quality of that gaze on his back, calculating, reassessing, deciding. He pushed through the side door and stepped out into the evening air. It was cold, the kind of cold that reminded you that winter didn't care about your problems. He had one more thing left to do before any of this could move forward. He had to face the girls himself. He brought nothing. No gifts, no documents, no prepared speech rehearsed in front of a bathroom mirror that morning. Victor had considered all of those things and discarded them, one by one, during the drive out to the suburbs. Children, in his limited experience, could smell performance the same way they could smell fear. Instinctively, without knowing why, they just knew when an adult was handing them something carefully constructed rather than something real. He had nothing real to offer them yet. But he came anyway. Riverside Park was quiet on a Thursday afternoon, a weekday lull between the school run and the evening crowd. A few dog walkers on the far path, a mother pushing a stroller along the concrete loop near the entrance. The trees were bare, the sky a flat, pale gray that couldn't decide between winter and spring, and the park benches were cold enough that nobody lingered on them without reason. Victor sat on a bench near the duck pond and waited. He'd confirmed their route through Margaret Doyle's neighbor, a retired man who watched the street from his window the way retired men do, cataloging the patterns of the block without meaning to. The girls walked through Riverside Park every Thursday on their way back from an after-school art program at the community center 2 streets over. Always the same path, along the pond, through the east gate, home by 5. He saw them at 4:47. They came through the west entrance, backpacks on, the taller one, Nora, walking with a kind of purposeful stride, the kind that said she'd already decided where she was going and the world could keep up. Lily was beside her, half a step behind, talking quietly, with her hands moving the way her letters moved, animated, expressive, like she felt things bigger than she had words for, and her body had to compensate. They hadn't seen him yet. Victor watched them approach along the pond path and felt something he hadn't expected, a nervousness entirely foreign to his body. He had sat across from rival bosses, federal informants, men who wanted him dead and were being polite about it while they figured out how. He had never been nervous in those rooms. Nervous was a luxury that got people killed. But these were two 10-year-old girls, and he had never done anything harder in his life than stand up from that bench. Nora saw him first. She slowed. Her eyes landed on his face with the particular focus of someone searching through mental files. And then something shifted in her expression. Not recognition, exactly. More like proximity to recognition, the sensation of a name on the tip of your tongue. Lily noticed her sister slow and looked up. "Hi," Victor said. He kept his voice low and his hands visible. An old habit, the body language of deliberate openness. "I'm sorry to stop you. I know this is strange." "You were at the cemetery," Lily said immediately. Her voice was steadier than he expected. She had a directness to her that felt older than 10. "The man in the black coat. You were at Emily's grave." "Yes," he said. "I was." "You're the one who picked up our letter," Nora said. She had stopped completely now, one hand on her backpack strap, watching him with eyes that missed nothing. She reminded him, with a force that was almost physical, of Emily. That same quality of seeing you clearly and deciding what to do with what she saw. "Did you read it?" Victor met her gaze. "Yes, I'm sorry. It fell and I—" "Did you read all of it?" "Yes." Nora nodded slowly, absorbing that, not angry yet. Processing. "Emily showed us a picture of you once," Lily said quietly, "a long time ago. When we asked who you were, she said you were someone important to her. Someone important." She paused, tilting her head. "She didn't say your name. We found it later, on the back of one of the photos she left us." Her eyes studied his face. "You're Victor. You're her husband." "I am," he said. A shift in the air between them, subtle, unmistakable. "She talked about you," Lily said. Her voice was careful now, picking its way through the words the way you pick your way across a frozen pond, testing each step. "She always said you were complicated, that you had done hard things and that hard things had been done to you and that she still believed you were better than the worst of them." She paused. "I didn't really understand what she meant when I was little." "Do you understand now?" Victor asked. Lily looked at him. "I'm starting to." Nora had not spoken again. She was standing very still beside her sister, watching Victor with an expression that had moved past recognition and was now doing something else entirely. Reassembling something, piece by piece, arriving somewhere. "Emily told us about the kind of world you lived in," Nora said. Her voice was quiet and precise. "She didn't use specific words because she said we were too young, but we understood more than she thought we did." She paused. "Kids always understand more than adults think they do." Victor said nothing. He let her arrive at wherever she was going. "Our dad worked in the warehouse district," Nora said, "before he died." Something locked in Victor's chest. "He was a good man," she continued. "We don't remember him much. We were really little. But Margaret has a photo of him that someone sent anonymously, and we keep it. He had a kind face." She looked at Victor directly. "Emily started visiting us about 6 months after he died. Right after, like she knew about it the minute it happened." The duck pond was very still. The gray sky sat over everything like a ceiling. "She never told us how he died," Nora said. "She just said it wasn't fair and that it wasn't his fault, and that she was going to make sure we were okay." She took a slow breath, a kind of breath that costs something. "I've thought about it a lot, about why she came, about why she made promises about keeping us safe, about why someone like Emily, who lived in a different world from us, who had money and a penthouse and a life nowhere near the warehouse district, why she would care so much about 2 little girls she'd never met." She tilted her head very slightly. "Are you the reason our dad never came home?" The question fell into the space between them and stayed there. A duck moved across the pond. A dog barked somewhere on the far path. The ordinary world continued its ordinary business all around them, indifferent to the fact that Victor Kane, who had faced every kind of confrontation the city could produce without flinching, was standing in a park in front of a 10-year-old girl and had absolutely nothing to say. Not because he didn't know the answer, because he knew it completely. He opened his mouth. The words weren't there, or rather, they were there. Yes, I gave the order. I didn't verify. I trusted a file and signed my name and went home and had dinner that night without a second thought. But the distance between knowing a thing and saying it to the face of the person who had lived its consequences was a distance he discovered, in that moment, was enormous. Lily reached out and took her sister's hand. It wasn't a frightened gesture. It was the gesture of someone who knew her sister had just done something brave and wanted her to know she wasn't alone in it. Victor looked at their joined hands, then back at Nora's face. "I can't answer that right now," he said finally. His voice was low, rough at the edges. "Not because I don't know, but because you deserve a real answer, not one given in a park with 30 seconds of preparation." He held her gaze. "And I think you're the kind of person who would know the difference." Nora studied him for a long moment. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." They stood in the cold together for another few seconds. 2 girls and the man who had broken their family, all of them knowing it now, none of them saying it plainly yet. The weight of it was enormous. And somehow, standing inside that weight, without running from it, without explaining it away or reaching for justification, felt like the first honest thing Victor had done in a very long time. "Will you come back?" Lily asked quietly. Just that. No accusation in it, just the question. "Yes," Victor said. He meant it in a way he hadn't meant many things. Lily nodded once, as if she'd registered a fact, then tugged gently at Nora's hand. They walked on along the pond path, through the east gate, and were gone. Victor sat back down on the cold bench. The park continued around him. The dog barked again. The stroller disappeared around the concrete loop. He sat there until the gray sky started darkening at its edges, and he realized he hadn't been thinking about what to do next. He'd been thinking about Emily. About how she had walked into a foster home 6 months after Daniel Brooks died and looked at 2 little girls who had nobody and had simply decided, without fanfare, without credit, without ever telling a single person, that she would be their somebody. And how the very least he could do was try to be worthy of the same decision. His phone buzzed, a message from Marcus. "We need to talk. There's movement. The men are asking questions about where your head is. The situation with the girls is becoming a problem. Call me." Victor read it twice. Then he put his phone back in his pocket and sat in the cold a while longer, because some things needed to be decided without the noise of other people's urgency pressing in from all sides. The situation with the girls. He was only beginning to understand how much that sentence revealed about everything that was wrong. The city had a way of knowing things before you told it. Victor had spent 20 years learning how information moved through Chicago's underworld, not through phones or meetings or memos, but through atmosphere. A shift in how men carried themselves in hallways, a change in the quality of silence when you walked into a room, the way conversations stopped a half-second too late to be natural. The city's criminal nervous system was ancient and sensitive, and it had already registered that something was different about Victor Kane before Victor Kane had decided what to do about it. He felt it the moment he walked into the Meridian Club at 9 that morning. The Meridian was a private members' establishment on the north side. Mahogany walls, leather armchairs, a bar that opened at noon for the public and at 8 for people like Victor. 3 of his senior men were already there when he arrived. Sal Marchetti, who ran the docks operation, Carver, whose real name nobody used anymore, and a newer face named Drift, who had come up fast in the last 2 years, and who Victor had always privately noted watched everything with the careful attention of a man taking inventory. They greeted him normally. The conversation moved normally, but the room's temperature was wrong. Victor said little, observed much, and left within the hour. By noon, he had received 4 phone calls, 2 from captains, 1 from a lawyer who handled certain financial arrangements, 1 from a man who operated 3 legitimate businesses as fronts and had always been aggressively uninterested in anything outside his designated function. All 4 calls had the same quality. They were ostensibly about routine matters, but underneath each one was a question that nobody asked directly. What are you doing? Where are you going with this? Are you still who we built this around? He returned none of the calls. At 2 p.m, Marcus arrived at the penthouse uninvited. Victor let him in because turning him away would have communicated alarm, and Victor never communicated alarm. Marcus sat across from him in the living room with a leather folder on his knee, the folder that meant formal business, the kind that required documentation, and he set it on the coffee table between them without opening it. "There's a faction forming," Marcus said without preamble. He had always been efficient when the situation required it. "Sal and Carver, primarily. Drift is with them, which matters because he has pull with 6 of the newer operators. They're not moving yet, but they're talking. About? About you visiting the girls, about the storage unit, about the fact that you've been making unscheduled, unsecured movements across the city alone for 4 days, while asking questions about a 5-year-old operation." Marcus looked at him steadily. "In our world, Victor, that pattern means one thing to the people watching it. It means you're either compromised or you're losing your edge. Neither version is comfortable for men who depend on you being neither." "And what do they want to do about it?" Marcus's pause was brief but complete. "They think the girls represent a liability, a thread that connects you to something that should have stayed buried. They believe that if someone outside this organization pulls that thread, law enforcement, a rival, a journalist, anyone, it unravels things that cannot afford to be unraveled." He paused. "They want the thread removed." Victor looked at him. "They want to eliminate 2 10-year-old girls," he said. Not a question, just the sentence, laid flat and plain between them. "They want the problem resolved," Marcus said carefully. "They're using more diplomatic language than that, but yes, that's the shape of the conversation." The room was very quiet. Victor stood up and walked to the window, the same window he'd stood at 2 nights ago with the whiskey he hadn't drunk. 42 floors. The city below, doing its ordinary business. All those lives moving through the grid of streets like they weren't happening right beneath an empire that would casually discuss removing children to protect itself. He had built this, piece by piece, year by year, decision by decision. He had constructed a machine so accustomed to solving problems by elimination that when it encountered a problem shaped like 2 small girls, it reached for the same tool it always reached for. He turned back to Marcus. "No," he said. One word, absolute and final, delivered with the full weight of the authority he had spent 20 years accumulating. Marcus absorbed it without visible reaction. "Victor, I said no, Marcus." He walked back to the center of the room and stood there, and something in his posture had changed. Not larger, not more aggressive, but settled, certain. The way a man looks when he has finished an argument inside himself and arrived somewhere solid. The girls are not a problem to be resolved. They are 2 children who lost their father because of a decision made in this organization. A decision made on bad information that was never properly verified. They are off the table, completely and permanently. "You understand what that means," Marcus said quietly. "The moment you put that line in the ground, you're choosing them over the stability of everything we've built. The faction reads that as weakness, and weakness in our world—" "I know what weakness in our world looks like," Victor said. "I've spent 20 years defining it." He looked at Marcus directly. "This isn't weakness. This is the first line I've drawn that I'm certain is in the right place." Marcus studied him for a long, careful moment. Then he reached for the leather folder on the coffee table, picked it up, and stood. "I'll relay your position," he said. His voice had returned to its flattest register, the professional neutral that meant he was no longer advising, just observing and recording. "For what it's worth, I don't think this ends quietly." "I know," Victor said. Marcus nodded once and left. Victor stood in the empty room and allowed himself 60 seconds to feel the full weight of what he had just done. In those 60 seconds, he understood, completely and without illusion, that he had just set fire to the careful architecture of 2 decades. That men he had worked beside for years were now running calculations about him rather than with him. That Marcus, steady, precise, indispensable Marcus, was somewhere between an ally and something else now, and the line between those two things was moving. He gave himself 60 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and started making calls of his own, not to captains, not to lawyers. He called a man named Gregor, who handled private security arrangements entirely outside the organization's structure, someone who owed Victor a debt large enough that it had never been discussed in specific terms, because it never needed to be. "I need a protection detail," Victor said. 2 subjects, children, suburban location, starting tonight. Low profile, no organization affiliation, completely off book." "How long?" Gregor asked. "Until I tell you otherwise." "Understood." He made a second call, an attorney he had used years ago for legitimate estate arrangements, long before the lines between his legitimate and illegitimate interests had blurred beyond distinction. He instructed her to begin paperwork for 2 educational trusts, the legal kind, the kind that would survive him if necessary. She asked no questions. She was well paid not to. He sat at his desk afterward and looked at the leather folder Marcus had left. He opened it. Inside was a single document: financial projections, operational details, a summary of the organization's current structure and its dependencies. He understood what Marcus was telling him, leaving this behind. This is what you're risking. Look at what you built. Look at what you're willing to burn. Victor looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the folder. He thought about Nora's voice in the park. "Are you the reason our dad never came home?" He thought about Lily's hand reaching for her sister's, that quiet, instinctive gesture of solidarity between 2 people who had learned early that the only reliable thing in the world was each other. He thought about Emily sitting in a folding chair in a storage unit, writing letters she never sent, building a quiet safety net out of her own pocket for 5 years because she loved him enough to stay and loved those girls enough to show up anyway. The faction was forming. Marcus was calculating. The machine he had built was turning its attention toward the problem the way it always turned its attention toward problems. And Victor Kane, for the first time in 20 years, did not feel even the smallest impulse to get ahead of it through force. He felt something else instead. Purpose. The specific and uncomfortable kind that came not from power, but from obligation. The sense that there was exactly one right thing to do, and that he was the only one positioned to do it, regardless of the cost. His phone buzzed. A message from Gregor. "Detail in place. Kids are covered." Victor exhaled. Then his second phone, the one almost nobody had the number for, lit up with a message from an unknown contact, 3 words only. "They're moving tonight." He was already reaching for his keys. He drove like the city owed him every green light. The message had come from a source inside the faction, someone whose loyalty to Victor ran deeper than their fear of Sal and Carver, deep enough to risk a 3-word warning on a burner phone. 3 words were enough. Victor knew how his own organization operated. He had designed the playbook. He called Gregor first. "Status." "Detail is outside," Gregor said. 2 men. Nothing's moved yet on the street." "Pull them to the front. Now. Don't wait for visual confirmation. Pull them to the front and do not let anyone near that door." He was doing 90 on the expressway before Gregor had finished confirming. The faction wouldn't send many. This wasn't a war operation, it was a cleanup. 2, maybe 3 men. People Sal trusted enough to handle something quiet and quick and deniable. They would come in a single vehicle, park a street over, move on foot. They would want it done before midnight and be back across the city before anyone connected anything. Victor had built that protocol himself, 8 years ago. He was 12 minutes out when Gregor called back. "We've got a vehicle, black SUV, no plates, parked on the parallel street. 2 men on foot moving toward the back of the property." A pause. "Victor, there's a 3rd one. He's already inside the fence." Victor's hand tightened on the steering wheel. "Get the girls out the front," he said. "Right now. Margaret Doyle as well. Move them to the corner of Elmfield and Park. Hold there. I'm 3 minutes out." "And the 3 men?" "I'll handle the 3 men." He hit the suburb streets at a speed that made the sleeping houses blur past like film frames and took the corner onto Elmfield on 2 wheels without touching the brake, and in the distance he could see Gregor's man moving fast across the front lawn, with a child on each side, small shapes in pajamas, barefoot, bewildered. Margaret Doyle behind them in her housecoat, one hand pressed to her mouth. The black SUV was pulling a U-turn on the parallel street, aborting the approach. They'd seen Gregor's men. They were cutting loose. Victor blocked the intersection with his car, stepped out, and stood in the full beam of the SUV's headlights. The SUV stopped. 30 seconds of absolute stillness. Victor could see the silhouette of the driver through the windshield, the particular tension of someone doing arithmetic. 3 men against a man who had run this city for 2 decades and was now standing in the middle of a street at midnight with nothing in his hands and nothing in his face except certainty. The SUV reversed, turned, disappeared. Victor watched it go. Then he walked to the corner of Elmfield and Park, where Gregor's man was standing with 2 barefoot girls and a woman in a housecoat, and he crouched down to their level. Something he had never done with anyone in his life. And he looked at Lily and Nora Brooks, shivering in their pajamas on a cold pavement, and said, as calmly as he could, "You're safe. I need you to come with me. I'll explain everything." Nora looked at him with those eyes that missed nothing. Her feet were bare on the cold concrete. She had apparently grabbed nothing on the way out. No shoes, no coat, no hesitation. "Okay," she said. The safe house was a nondescript apartment above a laundromat on the city's western fringe, maintained by Gregor, connected to nothing Victor officially owned, stocked with the basics and kept clean on a rotating schedule. It smelled like detergent and old radiator heat, and it was the most anonymous place Victor had available. Margaret Doyle sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that Gregor's man had made for her, hands wrapped around the mug, doing the impressive work of being more composed than most people would be in her situation. Gregor's men were outside, 2 on the street, 1 at the rear. Lily and Nora sat on the small couch in the living room. Someone had found them a blanket, thick gray wool, and they'd pulled it over their legs and sat close together, in the way that told you they'd spent years finding warmth in the same small space. They'd been given shoes, socks, 2 oversized sweatshirts from a bag in the closet. They looked very small against the couch cushions. Victor sat in the chair across from them. No desk between them, no distance except the truth. He owed them that. "I'm going to tell you something," he said quietly, "and I need you to know that I'm telling you because you deserve to hear it from me, not because I expect anything from you afterward. Not forgiveness, not understanding. Nothing." He held their gaze, both of them, steadily, the way you look at someone when you're finally done managing the impression you make. "You asked me in the park if I was the reason your father never came home." The room was very still. "Yes," Victor said, "I was." Lily's breath drew in, small, sharp. Nora didn't move at all. Her expression didn't collapse. It did something more complex. It confirmed something she had already arranged inside herself, the way you confirm a diagnosis you already suspected. It hurt, but it didn't surprise, and somehow that was worse than if it had surprised her.
5 years ago, Victor continued, someone in my organization told me your father was working against us, that he was leaking information to people who wanted to destroy what we'd built. The file was documented, detailed, convincing. He paused. I didn't verify it. I didn't ask for a second opinion. I trusted the man who brought it to me, and I signed off, and I moved on to the next thing on my desk. He stopped. Your father was innocent. The real leak was someone else entirely. The man who brought me the file knew that, found out afterward, and said nothing. Nora's jaw was tight, a muscle moving in it. She was processing in real time. He could almost see it, the machinery of a 10-year-old mind trying to hold something too large for its dimensions. Lily was crying, not dramatically, the same quiet leak he'd seen at the cemetery, the steady kind that meant something was moving through her that was too deep for noise. She wiped her face with the sleeve of the oversized sweatshirt and kept looking at him. Emily knew, Victor said. Somehow she found out. She never told me. I don't know if she was trying to protect me or punish me or both. But instead of confronting what I'd done, she walked into your lives and stayed there. 5 years of visits. School fees, Christmas, letters. He looked at his hands for a moment. She did everything she could to replace what I'd taken. The room held its silence like something sacred. Then Lily said it, quietly, without accusation, without performance, the way someone says a true thing because the truth has been circling them long enough, and it's simply time. Emily believed you could be better. Victor looked up. She told us once, Lily continued, her voice steady despite the tears still moving silently down her face. Not about you specifically. She never used your name back then. But she talked about someone she loved who had done terrible things and who still had something worth reaching for. She paused. She said she had to believe that it was the only way she knew how to stay. Another pause. I used to think she meant him, some general person, but I think she meant you. I think she always meant you. Victor said nothing. He couldn't. Nora had been silent throughout, but now she shifted on the couch and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not warmth. He hadn't earned warmth. But something adjacent to it. Something that was withholding warmth by choice rather than by absence. She wasn't wrong about everything, Nora said carefully. Clearly, you came tonight. I should have come much sooner than tonight, Victor said. Yes, Nora said simply. You should have. She pulled the gray blanket tighter across their legs, and in the gesture was something that was neither forgiveness nor its opposite. A 10-year-old's complicated grace, the kind that says, I see you clearly, and I am not yet ready to decide what to do with what I see. Victor could live with that. It was more than he'd earned. What happens now? Lily asked. He leaned forward in his chair, hands open, nothing held back. I'm going to move you somewhere safe, he said. Somewhere far enough from Chicago that none of this can reach you. I'm going to set up funds, legal ones, properly structured, so that your education, your future, everything you need is covered. Not as a payment. He was careful about that. Not because it cancels anything. Nothing cancels it. But because it's what Emily was already doing. And because it's the right thing. And because you deserve someone making sure you're okay. He paused. I'm going to keep her promise. Lily looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, slow, thoughtful, older than her years. Nora looked at the floor, then at her sister, then back at Victor. Emily always kept her promises, she said quietly. Every single one. It was not an endorsement. It was a standard. She was telling him exactly what bar he was being held to in the only language she had. Victor understood. I know, he said. I'm going to try to be worthy of that.
Outside, the city hummed and breathed its night sounds. Distant sirens, traffic, the muffled rhythm of a world that kept moving regardless. The radiator clicked, and the laundromat below them churned. Two girls shared a gray blanket on a couch above a laundromat on the western edge of Chicago, and the man responsible for the shape of their lives sat across from them in a plain chair. And for the first time in 20 years, Victor Kane was not managing anything. He was simply present in the cost of what he had done, and willing to carry it forward differently. It was the smallest beginning imaginable. It was also the only honest one he had left. The cabin sat at the edge of the lake like it had grown there. Old pine walls, a stone fireplace, a porch that looked out over water so still in the early morning that the tree line on the opposite shore reflected perfectly. A mirror world, clean and undisturbed. The nearest town was 11 miles east. The nearest person was a retired schoolteacher named Harold, who lived half a mile up the lakeshore and waved from his dock every morning at 7 without fail, because that was what people did in places like this. Nobody waved in Chicago. Victor had purchased the property through a series of legal entities clean enough to withstand scrutiny. The attorney he'd called from the penthouse had moved fast and quietly, the way he paid her to. The cabin was registered to a small family trust. The trust was connected to nothing that pointed back to his name, his organization, or anything that lived inside the city's long and complicated memory. Lily and Nora had arrived 3 days ago. Margaret Doyle had come with them. She had insisted, in the particular way of women who have spent decades caring for children and have long since stopped asking permission for things they've already decided. Victor had arranged a temporary, formal guardianship that his attorney was converting into something more permanent. Margaret had walked through the cabin the first morning, examined every room with the thoroughness of a building inspector, declared the water pressure adequate and the firewood supply insufficient, and then gone to find Harold to ask where the nearest decent grocery store was. Victor had watched her go and felt something close to gratitude. He sat on the porch now with a coffee he'd made himself. No staff, no service, no choreography of other people's efficiency surrounding him, and watched the lake while the morning decided what kind of day it was going to be. He had been here for 3 days. He had slept more in those 3 days than he had in the previous 3 weeks combined, which told him something about what the city had been costing him that he had been too close to see clearly. Behind him, through the cabin's thin walls, he could hear movement. Lily's voice, talking to Margaret about something in the kitchen. The particular percussion of cabinet doors, the smell of toast. Ordinary sounds. He had forgotten what ordinary sounded like from the inside. His phone had not been silent. Marcus had called 11 times in 3 days. Victor had answered twice. Brief, deliberate conversations that communicated exactly as much as he intended and nothing more. The faction was consolidating. Sal and Carver were making approaches to captains, reframing Victor's recent behavior as instability, positioning themselves as steady alternatives to a boss who had, in their telling, lost his nerve over a pair of orphans. Victor had expected this. He had prepared for it. On the morning of the second day at the cabin, he had made a different series of calls to federal contacts he had cultivated over the years as insurance, the kind of arrangement that lived in a sealed envelope and was never meant to be opened unless everything else had already burned. He opened it, carefully, strategically, not wholesale destruction, not a man burning his own house down out of guilt, but a precise and structured withdrawal. Routes, names, financial channels, enough to dismantle the parts of the empire built on violence and coercion, offered in exchange for arrangements that protected certain people and allowed Victor himself to exist in the complicated middle ground that came from 2 decades of having information everyone wanted. It would take months to fully unwind, years perhaps, and it would not be clean. But it was irreversible. He had made sure of that. Marcus would find out. Probably already knew, given that Marcus always knew things before he was supposed to. The faction would move decisively when they confirmed it. Victor had accepted this, not with the detachment of a man who didn't care about his own survival, but with the clarity of a man who had finally arranged his priorities in the right order and was willing to stand in whatever came of it. He heard the screen door open behind him. Nora came out onto the porch and sat in the chair beside him without asking. She had been doing that, moving through the cabin and its surrounding spaces with an increasing ease, as if she was taking careful measurements of the place and finding them satisfactory. She was wearing a red wool sweater, 2 sizes too large, and holding a cup of something warm in both hands. They sat in silence for a while. The lake held its stillness. "Harold caught 2 fish this morning," Nora said eventually. "He showed Lily. She named them before he could stop her, and now he can't eat them." Victor looked at her. "She named the fish," he said. "Walter and Professor Finns." Nora said this with the flat delivery of someone who had moved past amusement into a kind of loving exasperation. Harold seemed genuinely distressed. Victor felt something shift in his chest, warm and unexpected, the emotional equivalent of light coming through a window you forgot was there. He didn't laugh, quite, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way it hadn't moved in longer than he could calculate. Nora watched the lake. "You're in trouble," she said. Not a question. "Yes, because of us. Because of choices I made long before I knew either of you existed," he said carefully. "You didn't create the trouble. You just made it impossible for me to keep pretending it wasn't there." Nora considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything. "Is it bad trouble?" "It's manageable," he said, which was true, in the way that honest, difficult things are true. Not reassuring exactly, but accurate. She nodded slowly. Then, "Are you going to stay?" The question was simple. Its architecture was not. Victor understood what she was asking beneath the surface of it. Not just whether he would remain at the cabin, but whether he intended to be a consistent presence in their lives. Whether this was rescue or whether it was something more sustained and deliberate. Whether Emily's belief in him was going to turn out to be prophetic or merely wishful. He looked at the lake for a long moment. "I'm not the right person to be in your lives in any normal sense," he said honestly. "What I am, what I've been, that doesn't disappear because I want it to. There are consequences coming, and I can't promise you a version of this that looks like what other people have." He paused. "But I'm going to make sure you're safe and provided for, and that Margaret is here, and that this place is yours for as long as you need it." He looked at her directly. "And I will not disappear. Whatever happens, wherever this goes, I will not disappear on you the way everyone else has." Nora held his gaze for a long, measuring moment. Then she reached over and placed her small hand briefly on top of his. One deliberate second of contact, no more, and then withdrew it and looked back at the lake, as if the gesture had been a transaction she'd completed and could now move past. It was the most precise expression of provisional trust he had ever witnessed. The screen door opened again, and Lily came out carrying a plate of toast, offering it between them with the natural hospitality of someone who fed people as an instinct rather than a gesture. She settled on the porch railing, cross-legged, and looked at the lake with the particular contentment of a child who has decided, at least for this morning, that things are okay. "Walter is very fast," she said, referring, apparently, to the fish. "Harold said so." "Walter is a fish," Nora said. "Walter is Harold's fish now. He adopted them emotionally, whether he likes it or not." Victor looked at both of them, Lily on the railing with her toast, Nora beside him with her oversized red sweater, the lake behind them catching the morning light in long gold strips. He thought about Emily in that storage unit, sitting in a folding chair under a single lamp, writing letters that she never sent to children she had chosen without being asked to. He thought about what it had cost her, the silence, the secrecy, the weight of knowing and staying anyway. He understood it now, finally, completely, in a way he couldn't have before this week. She hadn't stayed because she was weak or afraid or out of options. She had stayed because she was playing a longer game than he had been able to see, patient and quiet, and certain in the way that only people with genuine faith are certain. Faith not in institutions or systems or the kind of power Victor had spent his life accumulating, but in people, in their capacity to move, eventually, towards something better than their worst decisions. She had believed in him past the point of evidence, and she had been right. Not completely, not cleanly. The wreckage was enormous, and the road ahead was complicated, and the men who wanted him removed were already moving through the city with their own calculations and their own sense of justice. But she had been right about the direction of it. His phone buzzed on the armrest. He glanced at it. Marcus. He let it ring. The lake moved gently in a morning breeze, just the surface of it, a fine shimmering that crossed from left to right like something breathing. Harold appeared on his dock 1/2 mile up the shore and raised one hand in his 7 o'clock wave, faithful as weather. Victor raised his hand in return. It was, he thought, a beginning, imperfect and overdue and built on the ruins of everything he had been. But Emily had taught him, from a storage unit on a forgettable street, from handwritten letters under gold star stickers, from 5 years of showing up without credit or recognition or any promise that it would matter. Beginnings didn't need to be clean. They just needed to be real. He picked up his coffee, looked at the lake, listened to Lily explain to Nora with complete conviction that Walter and Professor Finns were probably happier living with Harold than they ever would have been in the wild. Somewhere behind him the city waited, with its consequences and its factions, and the long bill of 20 years coming due. He would face it, but not this morning. This morning, there was toast on a porch above a still lake, and 2 girls who were not afraid anymore, and the quiet, irreversible weight of a promise he intended to keep.